And this session is going to be about the narrative. You know, we want to promote the work we do. Everybody does great conservation work. And now this session will be, how can we communicate to all the people we bring our efforts to? And our first speaker, and I do have to read now all this biography because otherwise I get lost in space. He has done so much. John Taylor. John Taylor has worked in wildlife conservation for over 30 years. He started out working on conservation mapping on long-term projects in Africa and Asia. Before moving into project management and impact monitoring, he has worked for the EU Life Programming, WWF, ZSL, and Save the Rhino International. Actually, that's when I met him. And is now Director of Conservation Optimism. And this is the reason why he's here. And that's based at the University at Oxford. And now we are delighted to listen to his work and his way of how to motivate and communicate people for conservation. Thank you, John.
Okay, let's get the stopwatch going. Time is what worries me here. Okay, and there's a clicker of some kind. Forward. So, once upon a time, there was a young boy who was born in a big city on a big island north and west of here. And he was born in quite a poor part of that city. And if you see old movies, you might get the impression that growing up in a poor part of London is full of cheeky chimney sweeps going, oh, blimey, Mary Poppins, and generally they're poor, but they're having lots of fun and living happy lives. Growing up in a poor part of the city isn't like that. Growing up in poverty is not much fun, so anybody that has any get up and go, gets up and goes. And the kids who are growing up there are surrounded by the people who didn't get up and go, who stayed and were content with the poverty. So there is a poverty of aspiration. And it's not a great place to grow up. But this particular kid, he was crazy about wildlife from a very early age, heaven knows why. His bedroom wall was covered in posters of tigers and elephants and later on Blondie, but that's another story. He spent his childhood, whenever he could, running around London Zoo and looking at all the animals there, because if you're a poor kid in London, that's the only exposure you're going to get to wildlife. 50 years later, he got to stand in front of the EASA Conservation Forum, and 100 plus people sat there and listened to him for 40 minutes. Hopefully, because he had something interesting to say, rather than just because they're very nice and polite people. The journey from there to here is a whole story. The Instagram version would have pictures of lions and elephants and great whales, and it would look great, and they'd be true, they're not fakes. But the real autobiography, of course, like any of our stories, would have a lot of self-doubt and imposter syndrome and mistakes and all of those things that we actually do when we're not giving the Instagram version of our lives. Stories are really important. Your stories in this room, I'd love to hear them. I'm sure everybody in this room has a story that's at least as interesting as mine. I've done these things 1,000 times and my mouth goes dry every time. Let's keep going. Stories are incredibly important. We will come back to why. For those who know me, it's lovely to see you again. For those who don't, I'm John. I'm the Director of Conservation Optimism, based in the Interdisciplinary Centre for Conservation Science at the University of Oxford, which is a wonderful place to be based. Formerly Managing Director of Save the Rhino International, which is where a lot of people know me from, if they know me at all. Formerly Conservation Programme Manager at ZSL. Formerly Zookeeper at ZSL, when they used to have Smilodon in the collection. Formerly a young person, but that was a long time ago. This is the EASA Conservation Forum, and we had a lot of conversation about this yesterday. It is not the EASA Conservation Science forum. And I just want to try to do a little bit of framing here. Conservation science is incredibly important, and I work with some amazing conservation scientists. Good conservation must be underpinned by good science. If there's conservation work going on out there and it's not underpinned by good science, then it's a danger to itself and others. So that conservation science is incredibly important. Probably the majority of that conservation science is social science. I'm curious, we'll get to know your audience in a minute. How many people in this room have qualifications in natural science? You're biologists of some kind. Brilliant. How many people have qualifications in social science? Uh-oh. But you're very welcome. We need to remember that conservation science is not conservation. It's an important part of conservation. It underpins conservation, but it isn't conservation. Conservation needs to be scientifically literate, but it needs to be socially literate as well. And it needs to be politically literate out there in the world. And it needs to be economically literate. And it probably needs to be literate in several other ways that I've just forgotten. But it's a big picture of working. When we were listening to Panda and Lucy last night in that amazing film, that was brilliant. But most of the time they were not studying slow lorises. I know they went out and counted them occasionally, and that's important work. But most of the time they were working with people. When we do our threat analysis, when we work through the open conservation standards, most of those threats are not going to be because we don't know enough about gorilla physiology. They're going to be about what people are doing. And most of conservation is about changing human behaviour. There's another thing, that conservation has moved on in the last 10 years. And we don't move on that quickly, us humans. But 10 years ago, we were all talking about field conservation. Conservation was something you went and did in somebody else's country. We go and do field conservation in Africa, field conservation in Asia. But then there was Paris, and then there was a 1.5 degrees report, and then there was an IPBES global assessment that said 1 million species face a risk of extinction, and then there's been the 6th assessment report and these other huge reports. All of that has been in the last 10 years. Conservation has gone global. The threats are no longer just local. They're still there, and fundraising for buying boots for rangers in Africa is still as important as it ever was, and please don't stop doing it. EASA zoos raised €200,000, more than that, just for Save the Rhino last year. That was brilliant. We need to keep doing that, but the threats are now global, and that should be good news, because it brings them within range of not only our fundraising skills, but our communication skills. But a lot of people don't think it's good news because they grew up studying biology. It's like we all went out and learned the violin and now we've joined a jazz band. Sorry guys, but jazz bands don't play the violin. So we've got to learn to play the saxophone. Things have moved on. ECF24 plus captures that new world brilliantly. But a lot of what we were talking about yesterday was field conservation. The other thing is, before I move on from this, and I do say this as a warning to us all, we have just got to think about the way we talk about people in other countries. I invite you to imagine the reaction if a bunch of people from Madagascar turned up in the Netherlands and said, "We've decided you're a big crap at coexistence with wolves, so we're going to teach you how to do it properly." I can imagine the reaction would be quite abrupt, quite rude and quite short. But we're talking about, we're going to go off to somebody else's country and teach them how to look after red pandas. There's a lot of cooperation. It's not that we can't work around the world, but we have got to change our mindset a little bit. The world has changed and we must too. This is conservation optimisms. But here's some framing. Just remember where we are, because this is part of the framing for conservation optimism. Greenhouse gas emissions need to peak by next year. Anybody who's looking at that and thinking, well, that's not going to happen, you're quite probably right. But then go and read the 6th assessment report that talks about what's going to happen if it doesn't. And then you come away thinking it must happen. Because the only thing more difficult than doing that is living with the consequences of not doing it. Global biodiversity framework. We've got 6 years to protect 30% of the land surface, 30% of the sea surface, restore 30% of degraded ecosystems. We've got to be nature positive by 2030. That's 6 years. We need to think about what kind of response we need in order to do that, and whether we're actually in that mind frame at the moment. My point is that the framing for this talk starts off as communication about conservation. We go off and do conservation, and then we go and tell people about it. Even looking at the EASA strategy yesterday, which is a brilliant thing, but conservation's in one chapter, communication's in another. And most of the strategies we saw yesterday, communication is a bit down towards the end somewhere. I'm not talking about communication about conservation. We can use these skills for that, and if you're talking to your board or whatever, these skills apply. But really, this is not communication about conservation, this is communication for conservation. Most of the conservation we need to do is behaviour change. You achieve behaviour change by talking to people. Some of those people will be in the countries where the wild animals live that you want to protect, sitting in the middle of a village talking to people about alternative livelihoods, environmental stewardship rather than destruction, looking after slow lorises rather than hunting them. But you guys get how many millions of visitors every year? Is it 140 million people visit EASA zoos? And I don't think that the people causing the climate change and the unsustainable consumption are mostly living in villages in Sumatra. I think they mostly live here. So there's an awful lot we can do with our communication skills, not about conservation, but for it, as part of it. Okay, rule number 1, know your audience, says the man who sat here yesterday rewriting this presentation as he was listening to all of the presentations that were going on yesterday. There was some guesswork when I put this together, but there was some radical rewriting last night. Anybody who gets an email from me knows how much I love emojis. So here's my audience, and that's run off the slide as shifty, but you get the picture. What are these people doing? Wake up, you've had your breakfast. What are these people doing? They're screaming. Absolutely, based on the picture by Morgan. He went for a walk one evening in the fjord above Oslo, and suddenly the sky turned the brightest of reds, as if a silent scream was passing through nature. People have theorised it was because of the recent explosion of Krakatoa, but it might not. It might be from something completely different. The person in the painting isn't screaming. They're blocking out a scream. Nature is screaming. The scream emoji is wrong. My point is, finding out about your audience isn't difficult. Whoever you're talking to, a bit of market research, a bit of audience research is old science. Your marketing teams, your communication teams, they know how to do a bit of audience research. It's really easy to find out about your audience, unless you don't ask, unless you assume, and then you don't know who your audience is. It's incredibly important. Step 1, you're doing some communications for anything, for conservation, for persuading your board to fund more conservation. The conservation and education team needs to be more than one person. Who's your audience? Question 1. Question 2, what's the journey you want to take them on? Conservation needs to be strategic. Conservation does need to be strategic, but communication also needs to be strategic. So question 2, question 1, who's your audience? Question 2, where are they now? And where do you want them to be? My favourite question, I'm an old conservation strategy head. That's why I found yesterday so interesting. Conservation strategies all over the place. My favourite word is an old English word. It's still a very current one in many European languages. But wherefore? Those of you with your Shakespeare, wherefore art thou Romeo? Doesn't mean where are you, it means for what purpose. Wofür? What for? What is the purpose? If you're standing up here today, if you stood up here yesterday and you talked to the audience, what for? What was your purpose in doing that? And if you're answering, no, I was just going to stand up and present my research. You've got an audience in front of you of 120 people, you've got 10 minutes or 40 minutes or whatever you've got. Where are they? Who are they? And where do you want them to be at the end of your experience? If you've got 2 minutes on the radio, that's different from 10 minutes in front of you guys, it's different from 40 minutes in front of you guys. What is the journey that you want to take them on? If you haven't got a clue what the journey is that you want to take them on, why are you doing it? If you've got people coming into your zoo, the first thing you do is rugby tackle them as soon as they come in and get that conservation euro off them. Thank you very much, fundraising. But then you've got 1.2, 1.6, whatever, million people coming through your gates every year. What journey do you want to take them on? Where do you want those people to be by the time they walk out of the gate? And if you haven't got a strategy for that, then what are you doing? This is probably the most important slide I will put up, and we could spend the entire 40 minutes just talking about this. You may have seen earlier models of how humans work, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Claire Graves' spiral dynamics is less common, but it's probably a better model. They're great models, but they're from the 20th century and they're a bit old. This is 21st century work. This is from Common Cause that I was involved with in its early days. But this is Shalom Schwartz's work. This is very much 21st century. This is a theory of universal human values. Everybody looks at it and tries to work out what kind of person they are. You can give that up for a start. The idea is we all have these values. This is all of us. And this has been tested. It started out in, I think, in Israel and in the US. It may just have been in the US. But then it's been tested not all around the world, but very much internationally, and it seems to hold. It's been tweaked as it goes along. But these seem to be the values that everybody has. And they're arranged in this way. I don't know whether you can see the colours, maybe not. But they're arranged in this way because they seem to have relationships to each other. So, I don't know whether this pointer works. I'm not sure. Anyway, top right-hand corner, that's kind of where we hang out when we're talking about conservation, unity with nature, protecting the environment, world of beauty. Those are those kind of values. If you want to split it up, top right tends to be about internal values, intrinsic. They're sufficient to themselves. They're self-fulfilling. Round here tend to be the extrinsic ones, where you're looking for an external reward of some kind. You want to split it up a bit more. It tends to be about self-enhancement versus self-transcendence. Tends to be about openness to change versus conservation in the fundamental sense, being conservative, not open to change. Interesting model. We could spend hours on it, but this is one way of looking at humans. Neighbouring values, for example, tend to trigger each other. So if you're talking to a bunch of people about environment, and they're not environment people, find a value close to that they do have. Perhaps if you're talking to international development people, start talking to them about social justice. That will get them into that space. And then it's not a quick, long journey from there to talking about environmental issues. When you go to where people are, you can reach them much more clearly if you understand the value space that they're in at that time, but you also reinforce those values. So if you're talking to business, for example, meet them where they are, people will tell you. Meet them down here in a world of social recognition, wealth, influence, success. And you can do that. You can turn up to a load of business people with a WEF report and wave World Economic Forum under their nose and talk to them about economics. You'll probably get the quick win that way. Meet them where they are. But in doing that, you're reinforcing those values. So if you want the quick win, by all means meet them down there. But if you want a long-term relationship with them, you need to think about bringing them up into this space. So how can we find ways where we're not talking the language of economics and social advancement to them, but talking the language of our bit of the world up there? Do they spend the weekends going out cycling outside of the city on their very expensive carbon bikes, that I would love to have? Find a way in, but don't necessarily meet people where they are, because you reinforce where they are and maybe you need them somewhere else. It's very difficult for people to be working with opposing values at the same time. Those of us who are famous conservationists, who have a high social profile, mine is not high, mine is kind of medium. But according to this model, when we're worrying about our social recognition and our status, we're working with a set of values that is opposite the values that we tend to purport. Something to be aware of. They're opposing values. And yet, if you don't have a decent platform, How can you be influential about conservation issues? How do you balance that? There are other models. This one I find particularly useful. But understanding humans is incredibly important if you're going to talk to them, and particularly if you're trying to get them to change their mind about something. Whether it's funding another position in your conservation team, or whether it's trading in their 4x4 for a bicycle before they leave the zoo. Framing. How much time have we got? All right, we're not panicking yet. Framing is everything. Framing, how many of you are familiar with the term framing? Because I don't find it easy to divide, not many. All right. Framing is how you look at a subject. Framing is how you put a frame around it. Somebody described it as a play. It's the scene, the characters, the whole context in which you approach a subject. Let me give you an example taken from us. I don't normally put lots of text up. I'll lecture people on the slides later on. But this is the Conservation Optimism website today. And it's about to be rewritten. But this was written a few years ago, and I'm picking on us because it's an example of something to think about before you write this stuff. Wild nature is declining rapidly, and the Earth's life support systems are under increasing stress. As nature erodes, and the response of human systems is inadequate or destructive, it can seem like the only rational response is despair. Then it goes on, if you zoom in from the big picture, you start seeing better things. It was written by a scientist. Scientists set out the problem, then we set out our evidence, and then eventually we come to a solution. But if you're reading this and you're not a scientist, what value space have we just taken the audience into? Half of the audience are no longer they're not going to get down to the solution because they read the first paragraph and went, oh my God, I'm so depressed, I'm not going to read anymore. A small number of them threw themselves off a balcony, so they're no use to us anymore. Framing is everything. And the framing on that is we start with the despair and the gloom, and eventually we lead to a nice solution. But even for the people who stay at it, we took them straight to a space of extrinsic threat, security. I am scared. And we'll be rewriting that very soon. To start with something positive. It is an interesting piece of framing. This is an incredible piece of work that went out from a lot of great conservation scientists recently. This is a brilliant meta-analysis that showed the impact of conservation work. And it's just interesting because it's a piece of framing. Read the paper and it actually demonstrates that something like 67% of conservation interventions actually have a significant or at least demonstrable positive effect. This is great. That's good news. That's brilliant. But the paper itself in Science was framed as the positive impact of conservation action. And then everybody else picked it up in the press, and its new study says conservation works. It works, brilliant, conservation works all over the place. Alternative framing, new study shows that 1/3 of the money we spend on conservation has absolutely no impact whatsoever, or makes the situation worse. Would be a quite legitimate framing for anybody who wanted to argue against funding conservation work. Framing is everything. And even in the scientific paper itself, the title of the thing is the positive impact of conservation. It's not wrong, it's absolutely right. But framing is built right into the title. We want you to look at it this way, not that way. Framing is incredibly important, and it comes into the values. How are we going to frame this thing? If I want people to change their minds, if I want people to... We did a great piece with wildlands, and Roy Schneider up at Wildlands a couple of years ago. What can Dutch people do to save rhinos? And we ended up thinking about it quite a lot. But a lot of messaging come from that. Apart from helping to buy boots for rangers, what else can you do in the Netherlands to help rhino conservation? So you're trying to persuade people to insulate their homes, think about how they transport, but also Dutch policy on renewables wasn't terribly strong 2 years ago. I don't know what it's like now. So talk to your politicians, talk to your MP, all these different places where in the Netherlands you touch power. But that's quite a thing to engage people on. If you want to, how are you going to frame it so that people go away thinking, I'm going to go out here and do something, rather than, oh God, that's a long list, I'm not doing that. Framing is everything. This is our positive communications toolkit from Conservation Optimism. I don't want to go through the whole list. It's just a whole set of traps that people fall into, whether you're using loaded language or whatever. The positive communication toolkit is online. Version 2 will come shortly with the values. The original version doesn't have the value stuff in. I want to put the value stuff back in it. But you can find it on our website. Go and read it at some point. It's interesting stuff on avoiding traps when you're framing communications messages. All of these are going to be a quick flick through. I'm here all week. Any that excite you, we can talk about them more. Tell stories, which is why I started off with Once Upon a Time. Somebody once said, I think, therefore I am, but that's wrong. He was incorrect. It should have been that. Humans are feeling creatures. We feel, therefore we are. The only thing we experience in our whole life is how we feel. What we think is fine, our understanding is fine, only in respect to how it makes us feel. We are feeling creatures. It's how humans work. We tell ourselves stories all the time. It's how our brains work. This is not just people tell you storytelling. It's a really nice way of communicating. It's important. It's not important. It's fundamental. This is how humans work. It's how our brains work. We tell ourselves stories all day, and when we go to sleep at night, we dream stories. It's how the human brain works. It's how it makes sense of what's going on around it. Tell stories. They reach people, and they reach people's feelings in a way that any kind of graph is never going to do. Facts help us to understand. Stories help us feel. And that's incredibly important. I love Yuval Harari. But Homo sapiens is a storytelling animal that thinks in stories rather than numbers or graphs and believes that the universe itself works like a story. Or Steve Jobs, if you're in that world. The most powerful person in the world is a storyteller. Storyteller sets the vision, the values and the agenda of an entire generation that is to come. And I used to use the Margaret Mead quote, the thing about never doubt that a small group of brilliant conservation scientists, plucky and good-looking, much like us, can change the world. But I don't think we need to change the world. So this is her daughter instead, Mary Catherine Bateson. But the human species thinks in metaphors and learns through stories. Stories are fundamental. They are not a nice add-on to your communication skills. They are your communication skills. And my presentation is not particularly story-like this morning because I'm trying to cover too many skill bases, and that upsets me because I'd love to do the whole thing as a story. And then get some skills. I've got some time. I used to work at WWF. There was a big programs division, there was a big communications division. Quite a lot of people in the communications division didn't really understand why the programs people were there. We're brilliant communicators, and we understand enough of this stuff. We know enough. These scientists, they just come along and overcomplicate things all the time. Mess up a perfectly good communications message. The scientists, on the other hand, thought they understood everything that was going on perfectly well, and communicating is communicating. I don't know why we need these other 40, 50 people over the other side of the building. Newsflash to all of us, of course they were both wrong, just on the balance of fairness. Have we got any communication specialists in the room? A few, okay, right. Being a communication specialist working for a scientific-based organisation for a couple of years does not make you a scientist. That's for the interest of balance. But for the vast majority of people in the room, being a really good scientist who has acquired the power of speech does not make you a communicator. Please, if you take away nothing else this morning, take that away. You've got communications teams in most of your institutions. If you're going to do 2 minutes on the radio, go and talk to your comms people. They can run you through it. They can help you. They can stop you saying, if they don't know, they wouldn't have you on the radio if they already knew. That's why you're there. Communications people can help you through all of these traps. There's a whole set of skills around comms, and most of the scientific community doesn't have them. Use your comms people. If you're presenting to the EASA Conservation Forum, you're using probably a presentation. We've all been to scientific conferences. How many slides have we seen go up there that look like a mini version of a scientific poster? And the audience is sitting there going, What's that graph? And there's that bit over there, and what's that bit of text? And that bit of... The person, on the other hand, could be reading out next week's winning lottery numbers. The audience is not going to hear, because they're too busy reading the blooming slide. Your slides add to what you're saying. Presenting to an audience, this is where I regret not having the access to the computer, because at this point I would just switch the slides off. A presentation is about talking to your audience. If you can't give that presentation, if the projector suddenly breaks, the slides go off, and you can't give the presentation, you shouldn't be doing it. You need to be able to stand up and talk to an audience, and the slides can help. They can give you a picture or show you a graph or something. But if you're putting up a whole load of complicated slides and then explaining them to people, no. It's a skill, and we all assume we can do it. And how many dreadful presentations have we all sat through in the past? We need to get some skills. We need to respect them. This is where, imagine, switch the slides off for a minute. You need to know what you're going to say. So now I'm going to talk about conservation optimism, and I've got 10 minutes left. The framing for conservation optimism is a really good case study because it's really difficult. Our mission, I'm cheating a bit because I would have switched the slides off and showed off that I know it anyway, but it's actually down there in front of me. Not looking. Conservation optimism shares stories of conservation success and hope, and we build capacity and community within conservationists. Who are we doing that for? Well, we're doing it for conservationists, but we're taking conservationists in the widest sense of anybody who is really engaged with the conservation mission. So whether they're professional, amateur, natural scientist, social scientist, not at all a scientist, communication specialist, anybody. And why are we doing that? We're doing that so that we can empower them to get to the world that we all want to get to, a diverse and biodiverse and resilient and healthy world for everyone. Not, I add, for people and nature. We'll have that conversation another time. But just as a side thing, if it's people and nature, then at some point the going gets tough and people have to choose. And if you present people and nature, they'll choose people. We don't do our work for people, for nature, we do it for people. Nature means many, many different things to us, but we are doing it for us. We're not doing it for it. And we need to be very clear on that. We can talk about that later, but we're not saving nature. Nature's fine. 10,000 years from now, nature will be fine, thank you very much. It's a blink of an eye in geological time. We're not saving the planet. It's not people and nature thrive, it's people thrive. And part of people thriving means a healthy planet for many, many reasons that we need to be able to articulate. That is conservation optimism, and now I'm going to read out the next week's winning lottery numbers, and you won't be listening because you'll be reading that to make sure that it says what I said it says. That's the message for conservation optimism, and it's a tough message because we did a webinar 2 weeks ago, and we were talking to a marketing specialist, and this is the picture that came into my head. There is a conversation to be had, and it's, hey guys, there's a tiger behind you. It's big and it's striky, and this one's got climate crisis written on one paw and biodiversity crisis written on the other paw. And it's big and it's fierce and it's pouncy, and it looks like that. Poland. Hey? That lost the impact, it looks like that. And that conversation is not an optimistic conversation, but it is a very necessary one. We have 1 year for fossil fuels to peak and go down. We have 5 years to be protecting 30% of the land surface, nature positive by 2030. There is a tiger behind us. Get up and run now. Run faster than you have ever run in your life. We need a wartime response to this, to what's going on in the world. We need a pandemic level response, not a comfortable, let's do what we did 10 years ago response. And that is an important part of the conversation. Get up and run now. If we did nothing for the next 2 days to discuss how we're going to respond to the crises that are going on, to talk about the EASA 21+, we would not be wasting our time. The trouble is, and I can go back to the slides, Christiana Figueres said it really well recently. Somebody going, run, run, run all the time. It's great if you're not running because it encourages you to run. But if you know this, if you are up and running, and somebody's going, crisis, emergency, run, there's a big tiger, did you see the tiger? It's, a sense of despair is understandable, but it robs us of our agency. Makes us vulnerable to mis and disinformation. And I love this bit. It prevents the radical collaboration. We need radical collaborations. Who was talking about us all working together yesterday? We need radical collaborations if we're going to do this. Doubt holds us back. So there needs to be another voice. One voice is saying, get up and run. The other voice is saying, we can do this. It's saying, if we, you run faster than you've ever run in your life. But you're not running alone. And we can do this. And there's a place up ahead where we can get to where the tiger can't get us. And there's a realistic path to get there. We have to run. Boy, do we have to run. And I don't think we're running yet. But we can do this. We can get there. And that voice is conservation optimism. It's not saying, don't worry, there isn't a tiger. It's not saying, don't worry, somebody else will sort out the tiger. They won't. It's not saying, but it is saying, don't give up. You're not alone. Because if people feel that amount of despair, they'll stop running. And conservation optimism is really difficult framing, but it is... Okay, got time. It is incredibly important. Talking to the people who are up and running and saying, we can do this, we can get there, we're not alone, we're going to do it together. We can do it. I seriously believe we can. It's a leadership role. We are shifting the conversation down from external threat, security, extrinsic threat to everything that we hold dear. Emergency, crisis, run, big tiger, rawr. Up into there is a possibility of self-direction, there is a possibility of choosing our own future, and we can go towards a world that is healthy and diverse and resilient. If we all get there, if we all run together, if we all run faster than we've ever run in our lives, we all help each other, it is possible. What do we do? Very quickly, whiz through. We share stories of hope every week. Follow us on social media. You get your 7 stories of optimism at the beginning of the week. We do blogs. We used to do podcasts. We'll probably do podcasts again. We do workshops. Constant messaging, sharing the story. It is possible. Things are working. There is hope. We can do this. We have a brilliant network of organisations worldwide that sign up to conservation optimism. I hope to add a lot of EASA zoos to this list by the end of this week. But really, we all need to be working together. Radical collaborations and conservation optimism is a really important part of that message, as well as get up and run. That's another important part. But I hope, we do webinars and we do workshops, and they're really amazing organisations, network of organisations. We produce tools. We've got the Positive Communication Toolkit. There's lots of other things on the website. We've got this amazing team. 1.5 of us get paid. All of these people, they're basically running a communications team. They're all doing sort of 0.1 input, a few hours a week, and they're all volunteers. They're mostly young, although not all of them. They're all over the world, definitely. And the calibre of these people just scares me. It amazes me. I'm just so flattered to have such amazing people working for us. Free. They are just brilliant. We have regional hubs around the world. We've got 2 in South Asia, 1 in West Africa. We're growing more. Where is East Africa? Where are the Americas? Where is Southeast Asia? But these things grow. But it's lovely to see people doing conservation optimism in their own region, in their own country, in their own context. We had 2 amazing summits in 2017 and 2019. Then there was a pandemic, you probably noticed. But we're doing another one this year in September. If you have stories of optimism and hope, bring them along and share them. If you seriously need to hear some stories of optimism and hope, come along and listen. It'll be a lovely 2 or 3 days. We are enabling, empowering, and empowering again. I think that should say embracing at the end. But we're looking after I was talking to the professor who at Oxford who set this thing up originally, and we were saying basically What we want to do is pick up the entire global conservation community, give them a big hug, assure them that they can do this, and send them out feeling empowered and enabled and hopeful and looked after. We went, yeah, do either of us know how to do that? But we're going to try it. Come along. Why? I've got time, just about. Why do we think we can do this? For me, it's because we're here now. Despite all the crap, there is no better time to be born. Under 5 mortality is better than it ever was. You've got more chance of being overfed than underfed in today's world. Why is that? Because we value the life of a child. Because we can see people, even if they look very different from us, in abject poverty and think, I'd like to help those people. All we have to do, I think, we don't have to change the world. I think the rest of the world will catch up with us. We are the advance guard. We're not trying to change humanity. But what we have to do, this is my 2 cents worth of 30 years of conservation, we have to be able to articulate the value of the natural world to your ordinary person in the street, in the zoo, coming through the gate, and just explain that to them so they add it to their list of things that they really value. It's not that hard. It's the world they live in. It's not like trying to get them to value Bitcoin or something. It's really quite organic. But people will look after the things that they value. We need to make sure that the natural world is added to that list. And before we do that, we need to be able to articulate very clearly to ourselves what is the value of the natural world. And we've been arguing about that for 200 years. It'd be great if we could come up with a really good answer in the next 2 days. Communication for conservation. Know your audience, whoever it is, and the journey you want to take them on. Where are they now? Where do you want them to be? What is the point of talking to them? Why are you doing it? How you frame it is everything. And it takes in all of the knowledge in that first line. Tell stories. They are how humans work. They work in stories. Use stories. Work on your skills. Do not assume. I feel anybody who's got a slide that looks like a poster and was going to show it today and is radically redrawing their slide, sorry. But do not assume. It is not easy. Good communication takes work. Work with conservation optimism. We'll help you. We all work together. Radical collaborations. If you want to talk conservation strategy with me, I'm an old conservation strategist and I'm here all week. But if you want to talk communications and conservation optimism, again, I'd love to have those conversations. So, now I'm overrunning. Who is my audience? The brilliant EASA conservation community. You guys are the most important conservationists in Europe. You have the best interface with the public of anybody. I'm a huge fan. Where are they now? Well, I don't know. I know some of them are up and running. Others, I'm not so sure. Where do I want them to be? I want them to be up and running hard. EASA21. All these targets by 2030. How are we going to get there? But I want them running with hope and with optimism. And honestly, I probably want them thinking quite nicely about conservation optimism, and I'd really try to be really honest, I probably think they think quite nicely about me. Did it work? Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I am so impressed. Let alone that you made it in time. We will have time for questions, but we do that after the other talk. I think then we know where we stand with time. So now our next speaker, I think some of you may know him. In comparison to John, he did not want to engage in wildlife as a child. He wanted to become an engineer, and he grew up in Australia. It just happened that he went to South Africa for a year in exchange, being an exchange student, and where he started to like African wildlife. And I think he's one of the only NGOs I know, I think it is the truth, working with giraffes. He is now living in Namibia, just came back from a transport of giraffes in Angola. Married to a lovely wife who's running the business with him and 2 children. And it's Julian Fennesey, the director of Conservation Giraffe Foundation. Thank you for coming up here.
Lovely, thanks very much everybody. It's great to be here, and John, thanks very much for making me look stupid for the next couple of minutes. Enjoy my slides. So, I'm lucky I get to chat to you guys for a couple of minutes, and I'm just going to give you a bit of a story. That's what it's all about. And it's going to go up and down, it's going to go around, it's going to be some of the worst slides you've ever seen. It's going to be some of our positive stories, negative stories, world stories about conservation. But what more can you ask for? This is probably what gets more votes on social media than anything else. A beautiful giraffe. But that's really what a giraffe does. It can't tell its story. Everyone thinks they're mute. It's such bollocks. The reality is we know so little about these animals that you conserve daily, that we're all here to help in the world, but this is what the world thinks of them. But yet we're fighting daily, good, the bad and the ugly. But really, what is the story we're trying to tell the world? We all love Nigel. He's still alive, by the way. So Nigel is this story about hope. It's about everything we dream for, everything we do every day to save these amazing animals and landscapes across the world. And Nigel is what you may see of GCF around the world, but it's definitely not what we do every day. What do? We sit behind a computer. We have staff management issues. We talk with governments. Here, all of these things that happen throughout our life. The bottom line, communication is hard. As an Australian, I would put normally it's bloody hard. But England doesn't like that in an advert they did years ago. They took the word bloody out. It's just a very nice adjective. Yesterday, I think Joao, who I haven't met, but an amazing talk, he gave me this inspiration. Australia is not down under. We've got the wrong narrative. We're up on top. And this is how we think. This is where we want to be in conservation. We want to be on top. We want to be telling the world what's going on. But unfortunately, we're damn right confused. The messaging that we're all sending out, the communication we have, maybe with its colleague next to us, maybe it's with our boss, maybe with a partner, we really don't know if we're telling the right story. More importantly, we're actually telling the same story but really differently and confusing at times. So I'm lucky I live in Africa. I've lived in Africa more than I've actually lived in Australia now, which I feel very lucky. You know, that was my choice. And this is what the rest of the world knows. It's one Africa. We're a beautiful social nation that comes together. What a load of bollocks. You know, there's 52 range states, all that are independent, all have different legislations, policies. The people are so diverse. It is something that if we can't even get this across to the world, how are we supposed to tell our conservation narrative to the community on the ground that we work with, whether that's in Uganda, whether that's in Namibia, whether that be anywhere in the world. The bottom line, I reckon, communication's broken. We don't employ a communication person at our office, so we'll differ with John from that. Maybe we should. But I think communication comes from within. It comes from knowing your story. It comes from sharing your story, and it comes from talking with people. Sometimes it's a really hard narrative that we're trying to spread. I think the issues at the moment with politics are fascinating. I love the discussions and try to stay out of every single one of them. But how can we talk about climate change when this bloke is having a bit of a laugh to the world at the moment? And you know, he's trying to make it great again, but we're trying to get the same story about climate change in this context. Or it might be about some of the most amazing animals in the world. Only elephants should wear ivory. If anyone was at the Kaza Forum last week, the Kavango Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area, which is the largest formalised conservation area in the world, across 5 countries in southern Africa, this was definitely not the narrative. They want to hunt. They want to sell their ivory. Africa is not one nation. Africa is diverse. 9 out of 10 Americans. I'm going to call bullshit. This is just propaganda. Apologies if anyone funds IFL. Happy to have a chat afterwards. The reality is that messaging, communication, what you're trying to get out there is what you're trying to get out there, not what the world knows. If anyone has ever been in Southern Africa or in East Africa the last few years, this is a massive story that's coming out. The good, the bad and the ugly about the big conservation lie. White versus black, big issue. It's garbage, a lot of it. It's a narrative, whether it's Mordecai, who's the gentleman on the left who's trying to tell this story, but there is equally as many stories from the other side. So how do you, how do I, but more importantly, how does the world be able to decipher what is the right story that they should be able to follow? I think the next 2 slides sort of says it all to me. This is from the communities. And I think John basically said this is fascinating, you know, going and trying to tell you how to manage red pandas or slow lorises. In Africa, someone from internationally, including an Australian who lives there, how do I tell you what to do? That's not my job. These are your animals. This is your country. My job is just to share those ideas and let's discuss it. Or it could be a government saying, basically, you can bugger off. We're going to do what we damn well like with our animals. We want to hunt them. We want to sell them. But, of course, these are diopposed narratives that in the world come down to lobbying. And that's something as an organisation at GCF we don't do. I have no clue about lobbying. But we share scientific baseline to make informed conservation decisions. Whether that works or not, that's another story. We can only do what our job is. And if I step back from this, listening yesterday and knowing a little bit in the conservation world, I might have worked for a few NGOs, governments, etc. over the years. We are really bad at using the same vocabulary for the same thing. Yesterday it was funny. There was lots of things said previously. We just use not the same terminology. If I look at the IUCN Red List, I was fortunate enough. I founded the Giraffe and Okapi Specialist Group many years ago. And we've done a lot of this work, and I used to work for IUCN for my sins as well. This is what people talk about. Endangered, very endangered, highly endangered. We amongst ourselves as conservationists don't even use the same terminology. So how is the folks on the street supposed to understand what really is a threat? Elephants are endangered. I looked it up this morning, they are actually now because they got split into 2 species. But before, they were vulnerable, but the world, they're endangered. It's like, elephant aren't endangered, they're threatened, and they're threatened in certain areas. So maybe we, as a good start, could use the right terminology. If we can't use it, how do we expect the rest of the world to follow us? Planning is another thing. John loves planning. Lots of good planning stuff discussed yesterday. I've been involved in many plans developed, just happened to do the African elephant strategy on behalf of 37 nations a few years ago. So I had some experience in this. But I'd love to see someone write a goal that's actually accurate. Every goal is different. And the problem is, what is an objective? What is a goal? So it really is important in whatever this conservation planning we are doing, that we actually learn the terminology, and often you have to go back to school to understand this. But if we don't get this right, we're going to miss it all. And that's a big problem. So for us as an organisation, we are small, but we really think we have a big impact as a giraffe. That's all we do. We don't touch anything else. But let's get it right from the beginning. We're not run, I might have a science degree, but I really, we're run by an engineer. That's what my wife is. And it's led, or sort of held up by a whole bunch of conservation science background. We've got clever kids that we can work with. But the bottom line is, let's get the foundation right. Let's be accurate. And then we can build on from there.
Julian and his wife Steph run the Giraffe Conservation Foundation, or GCF, from their home here in Windhoek, the capital of Namibia. It's the first giraffe charity in the world.
That's communication. You've got some random character telling the world who you are. It's pretty special. That happened a few years ago. We did a documentary on giraffe. It was on BBC. You just really think your life is over. I'm done. I've saved giraffe. Thank you, Sir David. But that, to me, was one of the foundations of what the world understands about communication. This is what they want to hear. So you have to give it to them. But you have to be clever about how you give it to them. You can't give it to that every day. So you have to work around it. And as an organisation, we sat back through COVID and we thought, what do we do? And we realised that giraffe can only be saved in Africa by Africans. All of us are just facilitating a process, which is awesome. And we've got to realise what our role is and what our job is and how we communicate that, internally and externally. We're a voice for giraffe, and that's who we are as an organisation. And I think it was really sort of great for us to step back from it when we thought about what we do. I might have written 100, 150 scientific papers over the years. Who cares? Most of them you would never have read. My wife has read my PhD more than I have, thankfully. It's a sort of, my grammar is awful. But all of these things are just pieces of paper. What we need to do is get these stories out there. We need to engage people. We need to get the world on our side to help save animals before it's too late. It's so easy to tell good stories. Social media, interesting, you can put this stuff out there and it's fantastic, you're going to get likes. They're not going to give you $1. They're not who your real audience is if you're trying to make money, but you need to keep them happy. So what we realised is that for communication, it's about us. It's about our team. We're 15 people from 11 different countries in the world. And we come together under the mission with training, support, education to help save giraffe. But these guys are our communicators every day. And I think that's important for every organisation. No one has one job. You have all of those jobs. You have to be on 24/7. If you go to the pub and you're having a beer and someone says something, your staff can't get up and punch them because they may know that they work for Giraffe Conservation Foundation. They may have a t-shirt, they may have a hat, someone may know who they are in the audience. It's really important to have developed a team that trusts, and you work together, you play together. We work in 20 African countries. This is a great slide because none of you are going to be able to read anything, but you're, like John said, you're all going to be watching it. Oh wow, did you see in Zambia what they do? It's irrelevant. But when we started, we really thought, what do we need to do? And giraffes, we thought, are everywhere. That's the perception. However, we found out that almost 90% of their range, very similar to black rhino, went extinct in the last 300 years. There's a lot of similarities between giraffe and black rhino in Africa, let alone many other browsing species. Did you know there's 117,000 giraffe in Africa? That's a shed load, isn't it? But is it? There's almost 4 times more African elephant in the continent than there are giraffe. So again, that's messaging. We don't have the budget of WWF. We don't have the budget of African Wildlife Foundation to tell the world. So we have to tell it in our different way. We can tell it so much easier when we can talk to people directly. And so, one of the things we sort of came up with a few years ago is part of that messaging, and that's how we realise how we do our communication. It's not constant, but it's through powerful things like giraffe are undergoing a silent extinction. If anyone's ever heard of it, Sir David said it. Obviously it came from our mouths, and it's something we are proud that we don't need to own it, but if it keeps getting used and it's powerful and it's helping giraffe and any other wildlife, that to me is what communication power is. But sometimes you screw up. Have a look at these two. 2014 is when we started World Giraffe Day. And that was sitting on a couch having a few beers and saying, well, we need to do something for giraffe. Everyone's got a day. So the missus and I came up with the 21st of December, the longest day for the tallest animal. And my wife said, you're an idiot, which is not uncommon for her to say that. And she said, there's no money in the Southern Hemisphere. It's like, good point. So, obviously, 21st of June. 2014, we had 4 giraffe. 4 giraffe seemed too many, it appeared, to our marketing team, Steph and I. And then we came up with a 2015 logo. We took away the blue one. The blue giraffe was hiding something that we didn't realise. The green giraffe is a boy. So that went on t-shirts everywhere, and it's very cool to see. Come up and have a look at John's t-shirt. It's got a Giraffe Conservation Foundation t-shirt. But look, it's got a penis. How ridiculous is that? You know, when it started going in the world and we saw people wearing t-shirts with that, we're like, that's a little embarrassing. But that's a communication story that we had to then turn the narrative around and talk about this is a family. Giraffe don't live in family groups. So that became another story. You know, all of these things flowed on, and it's like totally against who we are. But now we have a beautiful, very simplistic World Giraffe Day. But that's things that make a mistake, and you learn from it, you own it, and how do you move on in your communication messaging? This is a great one. Everyone else has come up with crazy World Giraffe ideas. We just came up with a concept. And I think, if anything, is the power of how things can be elaborated, how they can continue throughout the world. Without the zoo world, we would not have World Giraffe Day. 100%. It was taken by the zoo world, taken through, the communication message was 100% the zoo world. We just had to share an idea. We get to think outside the box. And this last year, or two, it's interesting to see the social media reach. It's boomed from, you know, essentially very little to 1.3 billion reach. Also, I think these numbers, I mean, someone's just made up something. But it is amazing that the reach continues to grow. And that's what it's about. Share your story. But the next person shares the story, and then the next person shares the story, and so on. So the more we can reach, the better story will hopefully lead. This is a good example to show you what AZA, the American Zoo Association, how much money they've given through the SAFE program for giraffe. As the only major giraffe conservation organisation, everyone thinks we get this money. It's not true. We'd love it, so please keep giving. But the reality is, obviously, you know, your time, field time, costs, everything involved goes into giraffe conservation. But I do think that if you look at 2014, when this started, this was all because of World Giraffe Day. And this has helped exacerbate and sort of bring giraffe conservation dollars to the table. We might be the lucky ones who created it, but everyone, and in particular giraffe, is the one that are benefiting. So that's super cool. But behind it all, we're a science-based organisation. There's no doubt. But we need to use science to make those informed conservation decisions. And there is lots of information and disinformation out there. We find out how many numbers there are. People publish everything. Numbers change. No one updates anything. So all of a sudden you see in new papers, old papers, numbers are all over the place. We'll talk about taxonomy in a minute. But getting that information out is also a problem. So what we do as an organisation is we update our information regularly and share it. In 1990, there was an estimated 155,000. 2015, below 100,000, and giraffe were listed as vulnerable when we did the red list assessment. 5 years later, we've just done a conservation, or we did a conservation status assessment, giraffe up to 117,000. We're actually in the process of reviewing the numbers, and we'll see what comes out next year. But this is important. You've got to go regularly. You've got to update your numbers so that you can provide the best information possible and not sit on your laurels. So the bottom line is positive. That's a 20% increase. That's pretty cool. Biologically, totally impossible. But who cares? No one really looks at it and they go, wow, well done, we're doing amazing news. Maybe we've counted them a little bit better. Maybe we've got some better numbers from people. And that is all because the story is getting out there about giraffe conservation. More governments are interested, more people are interested. We went to Uganda, and when we started in 2013 doing the first survey, there was estimated 700 giraffe in the wild. The next year, there was 1,000. We just counted them. It was really simple, individual identification counting. Through these methods and through the different science tools, we're getting better. And anyone in the zoo world, half of you like me, half of you hate me. Giraffe taxonomy. Is there one species? Is there 3? Is there 4? Is there 6? You don't have to like me, although I'm pretty good for a beer to have a little fun. But the bottom line is, science says there's 4 species of giraffe. It's not my work. I just happen to be engaged with it. So if this is what it shows, maybe wouldn't that help conservation of giraffe in the wild? Isn't that what our job is? Should we not stop moving giraffe around from one country to another if they're different flavours? Maybe in the zoo world, if we know they're different, we shouldn't be mixing them up. There's some really simple things that we're all trying to do is conserve biodiversity. We don't need to listen to some chappie from 150 years ago who had some really clever ideas. We can just use a little bit of genome analysis and figure this all out. And we have about 2,000 samples from across Africa, from every major population. We've done a shed load of work on this, so we know our stuff. And I think this is about communication. It grows, it adapts, it evolves. A couple of years' time, some other clever kids are going to come up and say, well, it's actually slightly different to what you think. But maybe we use the best information possible we have now to be able to communicate that to the world, communicate those who manage them, communicate those who want to conserve them. So we use all this information and we develop national strategies. I think we've done 11 national strategies in Africa. There was never a national strategy for giraffe ever before we started. I also used to have a hell of a lot of hair. And I think the stress of working and communicating with the government, if you've ever done it with, your government here, your government anywhere in the world, we work in 20 African countries. I literally go crazy every other day trying to have some arrangement agreement with the government. But we realise that if we don't do it at a national level, it's not going to have the buy-in. We can do a little project here and there, it looks great, but unless you have government buy-in, you are not going to make a difference long term. So that's why we chose to go wider and bigger and broader. And for every one plan we develop, we help implement it. Not all of it, but specific sections. And we say that from the beginning, that we're not going to walk away. We're not just going to develop and put a plan on the shelf. So that's critical. And those plans and the information from it feed into things which ZIMS, I found out yesterday, feed into. CITES, COP. Just happens we wrote the COP Appendix 2 proposal for Angola a few years ago, which was then used for CITES for giraffe to get listed. I'll be honest, it was probably the worst thing we ever did. Giraffe shouldn't be listed on CITES. And I'm happy to debate that scientifically with anyone. But it became an emotional, political decision that was made by lobby-based environmental organisations. Giraffe numbers, we just saw, are going up. Giraffe numbers going up occurs mostly in 4 southern African countries. In all of those countries, there is legal, sustainable use of giraffe. I'm not a hunter, I eat meat. But how can you tell me that international trade is causing the decline of giraffe, yet it is going up in the populations where they are only illegally allowed to do trade? It doesn't seem too complicated to me, but hey, what do I know? I'm just a scientist. Trophy, and then you get all these stories that came out. Trophy hunting pushes giraffe towards extinction. So this communication message that's going out to the world, it's absolute nonsense. It's not based on any science. And I think from us, what we're trying to realise is that whilst we think it should be about science, we realise it's not about science. It's about telling a good story. Did you know that giraffe are extinct? It's fascinating. I mean, we get shared all this information regularly. The world's last female white giraffe killed, the stories go on, from climate change, but specifically, elephants, all about trophy hunting and how bad it is. Again, trophy hunting, if you step back from it all, is a tiny amount of what happens in hunting. Again, we don't support it as an organisation. What we do in the 20 African countries we support the government, implement their policies, their legislation. That should be our job, and to communicate the information appropriately. But you're always coming up against these. You're always being told off, you're pro-hunting, you're this, you're that. And it's a real challenge, but you have to have big shoulders. And you have to just own what you do. And importantly, in our communication messaging, we stay away from all of this. Because when you tell really positive stories, this is an awesome one from Malawi. But this is what also has happened a couple of years after Malawi. People killed. I found out literally this morning why I put this on. There's been 100 of these elephants that have been culled in the last 6 months. But you're not ever going to see that in that conservation messaging. So we're all fed lies, but you've got to own your lie. And I think that's important. If you're going to prepare to go out there and tell someone in the world, you've got to own it. So these are the stories we tell. We tell positive stories. There is no way in hell we are going to save this world, for want of a better term, if we tell doom and gloom stories. I love your conservation optimism start to that, John. That made me giggle, because it's like straight away I'm like, oh, for crying out loud. We're screwed up, unfortunately, again. But we as GCF, we're selling dreams. If we don't sell a dream, we don't sell hope, we're not going to save anything in the world. But through our messaging, we need to get it through to the right people. And we need some good money out there. There's no doubt about it. But anyone who's raised money, and I'm sure there's many, many people here, can you tell me what good money is? So a little story about these guys. Many of you might know the Candy Crush. Has anyone played Candy Crush? Yeah, so many people, you've played it. Versus, say, an oil company. We're not going to pick on Aramco, but we are. So Candy Crush, the CEO, he just happens to be on our board. He also owns our office. He might have sold it for a few bob. He's Swedish, so he's tight. So he doesn't give his money away for free. You need to know your people. That's really important. But you need to know that when we get money from the former, CEO of Candy Crush and founder, that he hired 5 full-time psychiatrists so he could figure out how you guys are addicted to Candy Crush. So is that good money? The world thinks it's great money. Versus an oil company which is openly, sort of obviously ripping off lots of issues here and there, lots of human welfare issues. I've got some leather on that requires some oil. I've got to drive a car. I have heating in my house. So we're all happy to use that. But the conservation world, and most specifically recently, Smithsonian will not take money from Aramco because of what they do. I don't really know if we have really good morals or ethics out there, but it's about how you communicate what is good money, what is bad money. We personally, we obviously sit back, we don't take money from both ends of the extreme of the left and right lobby world. But everything in between, I'd like to turn bad money into good money, because we all need money. That's the bottom line. So for us, this is basically a little take-home message. Be vulnerable, be honest, that is critical, and take risks. We're all making a difference. So we'd love you all to be a voice for, conservation. It's not just all about giraffe. Lovely. So thank you very much. Awesome to be able to talk.
Thank you, Julian. This is